I want to preface my first question with just saying that one of the most problematic campaign promises that we've had to deal with since I'm on the legislature was the governor's promise to, quote, freeze utility rates on day one. What that did was give consumers, our constituents, false hope. They read that, they took that literally. When they get their utility bill, they expected it not to go any higher. Whether they were comparing it to the previous month, the same time the previous year, they really believed that it was not going to go any higher and eventually drop. So they would get their bills, and the questions would come. They would hear that a utility is coming before the BPU for an increase in their rates, and we would get bombarded with emails. I thought they weren't going to go up, you know, so this is the problem with that. So we had the unenviable task of breaking it to them that there's really no legal mechanism to freeze rates out of hand, and you know, try and convey that to them. So that was a problem that you're dealing with, and that's the climate we were dealing with this sort of thing, and rates, and you know, as people get their bills, and it's a monthly reminder for whatever reason, right or wrong, but that was the perception, and you know, that was you know, sort of a difficult thing for us, and we're still dealing with it too, and we will keep dealing with it every time a utility comes in and asks the BPU for a rate increase. So just wanted to put that, because that's going to, you know, tie into my questions that follow here. PJM put in place a temporary price collar cap on the basic generation service auction. The collar set a cap of $325 per megawatt day and a floor of $175 per megawatt day for the last two auctions, preventing prices from spiking too high as $500 per megawatt. You had stated that the collar is really what has helped keep these prices reliably stable. Is that correct?
The collar has helped to keep the supply costs.
Okay, so that was what really did it, the collar, not any sort of price freeze.
Well, the collar helped to keep the supply costs stable, but that's about 65% of the customer bill. While it helped to keep it stable, the results from the supply, from the basic generation service auction that feeds from the PJM capacity market, there were slight increases and slight decreases across the 4 EDCs in New Jersey.
Okay, thank you. Governor Sherrill declared a state of emergency on electricity prices on January 20th, 2026. The executive order acknowledges that the policies of the previous administration and legislature produced an affordability crisis, and at the center of policy making was the BPU. How does the BPU explain that the very first act of the governor was to declare an emergency over the agency's prior actions? It just seems to an outsider that they're looking to you to solve the problems of the previous administration.
I'm not sure I'm following the question.
How do you explain that the very first act is to undo what was done by the BPU, the previous administration?
So I would say, I think the governor made a commitment through her executive orders to address the affordability crisis and energy rates. I would not agree that it's undoing things from previously. The primary driver, as I just noted, of the increase last year was from the PJM capacity market. The market now has a cap. That was something that Governor Sherrill advocated for. The previous governor also advocated for. And part of that is the delta between supply and demand, and that is really the governor's second executive order that the BPU is working to implement, and that is to bring more generation resources online as quickly as we can. And again, there's a big focus on solar and storage for that very reason. And so that is what we are doing.
Okay, in fact, I'm glad you brought that up about supply and demand, because wouldn't you agree that the decrease in energy supply in the state is at the root cause of the spike in exorbitant utility rates? And keep in mind that there were I believe four natural gas plants that were closed down within the last 10 years, and certainly Oyster Creek went offline during that period, and there was a time when we were a net exporter of energy, and now I think it's 40% that we import. So the decrease in supply is what's driving the high utility rates, not necessarily PJM or data centers or whatever else is being blamed for this, but the actual decrease in supply in state here is what's driving the utility rates high.
I actually would not agree. The increase in demand is a significant contributor to the costs that we are experiencing now from data centers. There's an independent market monitor that oversees PJM. The capacity market spike that we saw in the capacity market the year before last that fed into last year's very high bills, the majority of that was driven by data center demand growth. So we certainly need more electricity generation. We would like it to be built in New Jersey. That is, part of why the last administration supported offshore wind. That is why we are looking at solar and storage and nuclear. But it is the demand from data centers that were a very significant driving factor in the cost increase.
So you don't think diminishing supply through closing those 5 major generation plants is at least a major contributor to the higher rates?
I think reducing supply, any kind of supply, or not building supply fast enough to meet demand is going to be a factor, but those decisions were business decisions, and I would speculate to say if the prices were at $325 a megawatt day, there may have been the kinds of investments needed to keep those plants operational.
Okay, but we do agree. I think that diminishing supply will have a negative impact on rates, pushing them higher.
Any diminishing supply, just like increasing demand, yes.
Okay. And when we talk about freezing rates, providing credits isn't really freezing the rates. That's just offsetting the increases, correct?
So offsetting the increase on the supply side and pausing the consideration of any increases on the distribution side are effectuating the rate freeze.